Everything just broke. In Washington, the system has crossed a line never seen before, without precedent. For the first time in 50 years, and Donald Trump is now isolated by the very institutions that once shielded him. This is no warning shot. This is the consequence. So, how did America reach the moment where power turns on its own? Stay with us, because what happens next decides who really pays the price. Before the noise, before the speeches, before the counter-accusations, the facts are already on the table. Donald Trump is facing 4 established lines of legal exposure: alleged interference with the electoral process, the improper handling and retention of classified materials, obstruction of justice tied to subpoenas and court orders, and financial misconduct, now intersecting with court-mandated disclosures. These are not abstract claims. They are active investigations, live dockets, and binding orders. Now to the trigger. In a decisive move, the Supreme Court has rejected a request for special protection that would have delayed compliance and expanded claims of immunity. The ruling is unambiguous. No individual former president included stands above the law. Orders issued by lower courts must be executed. Discovery must proceed. Testimony must be given. Documents must be produced. The court's language is not ornamental. It is operational. That is the point of ignition. Because from here, the conflict ceases to be political theater and becomes a constitutional collision when a former president refuses to comply or seeks to run out the clock through procedural maneuvering. The dispute is no longer about guilt or innocence. It is about whether personal power can overrule the judicial branch. It is about whether delay itself can function as immunity. I say this with the weight of decades covering institutional breakdowns. I have rarely seen a moment this stark. The system is signaling that it will not bend. And the subject of that signal is responding with contempt. Publicly, Trump has dismissed the allegations as trivial, mocked the courts, and framed the process as harassment. Privately, according to filings and timelines, his legal strategy continues to press delay appeals, stacked on appeals, privilege claims stretched beyond precedent. The posture is unmistakable: minimize the charges, ridicule the authority, and treat compliance as optional. It is a calculated gamble against the clock. The institutional meaning is severe. When a former president treats binding orders as suggestions, the separation of powers enters uncharted territory. This is the flashpoint where personal survival collides with the rule of law. And when that happens, enforcement mechanisms do not pause. They escalate. The consequences did not wait for a verdict. Markets reacted immediately. Political risk was priced in within hours. Bond yields edged higher as uncertainty widened. Borrowing costs ticked up not because of policy, but because of instability. Investors read court calendars the way they read balance sheets. Confidence is fragile, and it breaks quickly when the legal foundation of governance is questioned. For ordinary Americans, this translates into higher interest rates, delayed investment, and tightening credit. Retirement portfolios feel the volatility first. Small businesses feel it next. When capital hesitates, hiring slows. When risk premiums rise, households pay more quietly, relentlessly. This is why the moment matters. This is not a debate over personality. It is not a partisan skirmish. It is a test of whether judicial authority can compel compliance from the most powerful political figure of a generation. I will be direct. It is difficult even for me to absorb how fast this escalated. I have not seen the guardrails tested this openly in modern times. And the most dangerous signal is not the court's firmness. It is the subject's indifference when the damage to citizens is treated as collateral, when economic pain is waved away as a footnote. The crisis moves from legal to moral. That is where this story begins. The board is now visible. Every major actor has taken a position. and none of them are comfortable. At the center remains Donald Trump. His posture has not changed. He continues to deny the allegations outright, ridiculing the legal system as corrupt and politically motivated. In public statements and filings, he minimizes the substance of the charges and treats compliance as a tactical choice rather than a constitutional obligation. The economic and social consequences that follow market instability, stalled governance. Rising costs for ordinary citizens are brushed aside as secondary. To Trump, survival comes first. The system is something to be mocked, delayed, or bent. Across from him stands the judiciary and the Department of Justice. Their role has hardened. Court timelines are tightening. Enforcement is no longer theoretical. Subpoenas are being pressed forward. Immunity claims are being rejected with precision. What matters here is not rhetoric, but sequencing. Once courts move from interpretation to execution, discretion narrows. The machinery becomes difficult to stop. I have covered moments when prosecutors hesitated. This is not one of them. Then there is the Senate, quietly, methodically. It has begun to reassert its constitutional role as a brake on executive overreach, particularly around emergency powers. The signal is unmistakable. Lawmakers are no longer willing to provide political cover for maneuvers that could be read as shielding a single individual from judicial oversight. This is not framed as opposition to Trump the man. It is framed as protection of institutional survival. That distinction matters because it gives wavering senators a justification that is not ideological, but procedural. The Republican Party is where the fracture is most dangerous. For years, loyalty functioned as a form of insurance, but legal exposure has a way of changing calculations. As court orders harden and enforcement accelerates, association becomes risk. Donors hesitate. Polling tightens. Legal counsel advises distance. The result is not dramatic denunciation, but silence. Support evaporates not with speeches, but with absence. I have watched parties turn on leaders before. It rarely begins with rebellion. It begins with self-preservation. And then there are the people often omitted from these diagrams. They absorb the cost last and feel it longest. When institutions turn inward, governance slows, budget decisions stall, regulatory clarity disappears, programs tied to healthcare, housing, and Social Security planning face delays not because they are controversial, but because attention is elsewhere. Markets react faster than legislatures. Credit tightens faster than relief arrives. The public pays while elites maneuver. Why now? Because the constitutional risk crossed a threshold. Allowing personal power to override binding court orders is not a policy disagreement. It is a structural threat. Once that precedent is tolerated, it becomes repeatable. Lawmakers understand this. Judges understand this. Even Trump's allies understand it privately, if not publicly. Election pressure compounds the urgency. Legal exposure does not remain isolated. It spreads to those who defend it. Subpoenas widen. Testimony implicates. Silence becomes safer than solidarity. That is the logic now driving decisions behind closed doors. I will be candid. It is difficult even for me to fully process how quickly the alignment shifted. I have never seen institutional patience drain this fast. The tone has changed. The language is sharper. The tolerance for delay is gone. Trump continues to mock the process, dismissing it as inconsequential. But the system is no longer listening to him. It is listening to the calendar, the statutes, and the limits written into the Constitution. That is what makes this moment so dangerous. When one actor treats the damage to society as acceptable collateral, and every other actor begins to move in response. The board does not stabilize. It destabilizes. The break did not arrive with spectacle. It arrived with a procedure. An emergency session of the Senate was convened, not as a show of defiance, but as an act of containment. What formed inside that chamber was not a protest bloc, but a bipartisan alignment driven by a shared calculation. Emergency authority cannot be repurposed as a personal shield. When powers designed for national crises are redirected to protect one individual from judicial oversight, the line between governance and self-preservation collapses. The decision that followed was narrow in language and severe in effect. The Senate moved to block the use of emergency powers as a defensive maneuver, not postponed, not softened, blocked. In constitutional terms, this was a firewall, an attempt to stop the spread before it became irreversible. I have seen Congress hesitate at moments like this. This time, hesitation was absent. The political consequences were immediate. Allies who once appeared immovable began to withdraw. Some did so openly, issuing carefully worded statements about respecting the courts and institutional norms. Others chose silence more damaging, in many ways, than opposition. Silence signals calculation. Silence signals legal advice. Silence signals distance. In Washington, that silence echoed louder than any floor speech. This is how institutional loyalty breaks. Not with denunciations, but with absence. Donald Trump's response followed a familiar pattern. He labeled the process rigged. He framed the Senate's action not as constitutional enforcement, but as betrayal. He returned to the language that sustains his core supporters' grievance: conspiracy, retaliation. The message was not aimed at institutions. It was aimed past them directly at a base he continues to mobilize as leverage. What was absent from that response matters more than what was said. There was no acknowledgement of rising interest rates now pricing in political risk. No mention of retirement funds absorbing volatility triggered by uncertainty at the top of the system. No reference to businesses delaying hiring or investment because governance appears frozen. No concern for households facing higher borrowing costs or communities bracing for stalled public services. These were treated as irrelevant side effects. Collateral. I have covered leaders under pressure before. I have never seen indifference to public cost expressed this plainly. As the political noise intensified, the legal machinery advanced. Cases previously slowed by appeals and immunity claims were reactivated. Courts, now armed with clear guidance, began enforcing timelines with precision. Subpoenas regained force. Discovery resumed. The risk of contempt, once theoretical, became tangible. Non-compliance now carries automatic consequences, not discretionary warnings. Asset exposure entered the discussion in a way it had not before. Financial restrictions, freezes, and court-supervised enforcement are no longer distant possibilities. They are logical extensions of defiance in a system designed to compel compliance. This is not punishment by spectacle. It is enforced by design. Here is the part that is hardest to explain, even for someone who has watched multiple constitutional crises unfold. Once institutions decide that delay itself has become the threat, the process accelerates. Safeguards tighten. Discretion narrows. Each refusal triggers the next mechanism. Each escalation removes another off-ramp. What looked like flexibility days ago now feels like inevitability. I find this difficult to say aloud, but it must be said I have never seen the guardrails engage this quickly. The Senate's move did not resolve the crisis. It confirmed it by acting. Lawmakers acknowledged that the system could no longer rely on informal restraint. Formal enforcement became unavoidable. That acknowledgement is the true fracture, the moment when trust gives way to compulsion. Trump continues to mock the process, treating allegations as minor inconveniences and institutional resistance as proof of persecution. But the system has shifted its focus. It is no longer responding to his words. It is responding to his actions. And while the confrontation plays out at the highest levels, The consequences flow downward. Markets adjust. Credit tightens. Services stall. The public absorbs the cost while institutions defend their boundaries. This is no longer a political dispute. It is a structural collision between personal power and constitutional limits. And once that collision begins, it does not end with rhetoric. It ends with enforcement. This is the point where the crisis leaves Washington and enters daily life. Financial markets reacted first, not with panic, but with calculation. Equity markets turned volatile as investors priced in political risk that had not existed days earlier. The U.S. dollar faced renewed pressure. Treasury yields edged upward not because of inflation data, but because confidence in institutional stability had weakened. This is how political damage becomes economic reality. For ordinary Americans, the consequences were immediate and measurable. Retirement accounts fluctuated sharply. Millions of households with 401(k)s and pension funds saw balances swing in a matter of hours. Mortgage rates and consumer lending costs rose as lenders adjusted risk premiums. For families already stretched by high living costs, this was not theoretical harm. It was money leaving their pockets. Businesses responded by doing what uncertainty forces them to do: pause. Investment decisions were delayed. Hiring plans were frozen. In some sectors, temporary contracts were quietly allowed to expire. Job insecurity increased, not because of market fundamentals, but because governance itself had become unpredictable. Public services also felt the strain. As senior officials resigned or withdrew from decision-making, administrative delays spread. Budget approvals slowed. Policy coordination weakened. What citizens experienced was not a dramatic collapse, but something more corrosive: inefficiency, confusion, and silence from institutions that are supposed to function regardless of politics. Internationally, allies took notice. NATO partners questioned the reliability of in everyone. Command continuity. Foreign governments began preparing contingency plans. America's credibility did not vanish, but it thinned, and rebuilding it will take time. Throughout this period, Donald Trump's response followed a consistent pattern. His rhetoric escalated. He dismissed institutional warnings as political theater. He framed legal consequences as persecution. What he did not address were rising borrowing costs, shaken pensions, or stalled livelihoods. Civilian losses were treated as acceptable collateral. I have covered economic crises, security breakdowns, and constitutional confrontations before. I have never seen consequences travel this quickly from courtroom rulings to kitchen tables. This is no longer about politics. It is about who pays when power refuses restraint. What has been established is no longer in dispute. Serious legal allegations exist and remain unresolved. Investigations into election interference, the mishandling of classified materials, obstruction of judicial processes, and resistance to lawful subpoenas were not dismissed as political noise. Courts issued binding rulings. Appeals failed. Attempts to cloak personal exposure behind emergency authority were halted. And in response, the executive machinery and the governing party that once shielded it fractured under the strain. This sequence matters because democracies are tested not by calm, but by defiance. When a president or any individual with concentrated power treats judicial orders as optional, the crisis ceases to be partisan. It becomes constitutional. The point of ignition was not resignation or indictment. It was refusal. Refusal to comply. Refusal to accept limits. Refusal to recognize that the law binds office holders precisely when it is inconvenient. I have covered institutional breakdowns across decades. I have seen governments stumble, markets shake, alliances wobble. What is difficult even for me to process is the speed with which this confrontation moved from legal briefs to systemic risk. I have rarely witnessed a moment when the guardrails were tested so openly, so deliberately, and with such public disdain. The institutional verdict is stark. If a democracy allows one person to ignore court authority without swift constraint, that is not resilience. It is failure specifically, a failure to protect citizens from the abuse of power. No election result, no polling advantage, no rhetorical loyalty can justify that breach. The costs are not abstract. They are borne by the public. Taxes and borrowing costs rise as political risk is priced into the economy. Policy becomes weaker and slower as leadership capacity erodes. Public administration falters when senior officials withdraw rather than become complicit. The cumulative effect is a democracy that is less predictable, less credible, and less secure than it was yesterday. Throughout this process, Donald Trump's posture remained consistent. He minimized the allegations. He mocked institutional warnings. He framed legal accountability as a trivial nuisance, something unworthy of serious attention. What he did not acknowledge were shaken pensions, rising interest rates, or stalled livelihoods. Civilian harm was treated as background noise, acceptable collateral in a personal fight for survival. That contrast is the final evidence. This is not merely a story about Donald Trump. It is a test of whether the system can still draw a line when power crosses it, whether courts can enforce their orders, whether legislatures can act before damaging compounds, whether the rule of law remains stronger than the will of one individual. The moral verdict is simple and unforgiving. A democracy either restrains power or it teaches its citizens that restraint is optional. The question now is not who shouted loudest. It is whether the system still has the strength to protect the people who depend on it. Thank you for staying with me until these final moments. It truly means a great deal. If this story touched you or sparked reflection, please leave a like, hit subscribe, and share so our voices can reach further. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and I will see you in the next journey. Farewell.